What they both have in common is that they each have gone full circle, only in the opposite direction, and because of that, there is vast language overlap between these two enemies. To the untrained ear, they are making the same statement, but in fact they do not, since the authors of each statement are not the same. One is reality, the other is ideology. Carl Sagan claims there are no gaps, and we also claim there are no gaps. However, we are not saying the same thing. We are maintaining that there are no gaps in the naturalist fossil record, because there are no species within ideology, since ideologies do not have the efficacy to refer to reality, such as species. Species only exist in reality, not within the ideology within which naturalists are referring. Ideologies lack referential capability. By contrast, Carl Sagan believes wholeheartedly that his ideology of naturalism and physicalism is in fact referring to species or to diversity or multiplicity or duality of things. Mind, self-aware or not, cannot refer to reality. Naturalism is that very mindset, and because it has a gap in itself, it privileges to refer or to equate to the other part of the self, which produces an instance of artificial intelligence or counter-reference, which is self-reference and further subjectivism. When faced with a question from a creationist about the gaps in the theory of evolution, what was Mr. Sagan's response? His reply was, "What gaps? There are no gaps in the theory." So, let us ask, do the income gaps postulated by naturalism through the theory of democracy also not exist? Inequality gaps have been postulated by naturalism. Naturalism is a litany of inequality gaps. It starts and ends with gaps and equations. But when it comes to the theory of evolution, all of a sudden, when the time has come to win an argument, there are no gaps. Natural science at its most sincere. Also, on what scientific basis are you claiming there are no gaps? Mr. Sagan explains in the following way. There are no gaps because the fossil record and the records of transitional forms are necessarily inconclusive. Just like 2 + 2 = 7, and my evidence for it is necessarily inconclusive. Any questions? On the basis of what are you privileging 7 over 5? To privilege ideology over reality as basis is not science or knowledge. The theory of evolution does not use referential language. We simply do not accept that theory or ideology, be it complete or incomplete, is referring to DNA, or to pigeons, or animals, or observations or species. All these terms, when authored by theory, are not references to reality. If and only if God does not exist, then sounds maintaining internal consistency or synonymy long enough to pass initial plausibility of language in order to deny God are indeed language. Such attempt at language you can call naturalism or whatever you will, but whether or not it is a language at all must be questioned and not taken as the self-evident starting point of communication. Naturalists have been given the benefit of the doubt just because they can make sounds that many have meanings to us. Sounds of words are not words because they lack an author who is a being. Truth is behind sound, light, and form. As a further example of the self-referentialist noise of the naturalists, consider the claim that the universe is expanding, the so-called universe, aside from the minor fact that it does not exist, since within naturalism it is submitted as a postulate, yet to be proven, yet treated on faith or doubt as if it was an established presence. Aside from that fact, the universe is not expanding, but shrinking. What may be expanding is the universe within naturalism, not the universe. What is expanding is your hypothetical mathematical concept insofar as it makes the logical sense to speak of concepts or ideas expanding through space and time reality. That is, where is the physical address of that idea called universe, or the idea called cosmos, which is expanding? Outside of the attempted language, outside of pseudo-language, the universe is not expanding but shrinking. In fact, it is imploding. Nothing escapes the attention of natural science, like reality. Let us complete the economic argument. Free market was postulated by the classical liberals, in order to free the wealth from the crown, and not in order to enrich the subjects, whom liberals told were limited in wealth, since the king had more than they did. Nowadays, conservatives use the following argument: the state should use its power to regulate the market. For instance, the government should intervene into the market and not allow American companies to leave abroad, even though such interference is a limit on the market. However, it is a necessary step to preserve the U.S. market, even thought that intervention to some degree discredits the markets. That argument has the liberal error in it. It is not true that the government intervention into the economy to conserve the economy from being relocated to China is a limit on the U.S. economy. It is not limit, but a fulfillment and completion of the U.S. economy. And it does not become a limit just because we cannot find a law or principle or category for that intervention. Such intervention is personal, and it does not require justification. As a matter of fact, had we began worrying about justifying our own existence, we would need to revise our steps. Intervention into the markets does not discredit the markets, which initiated by the authors of the market, when initiated by the authors of the market. So, not destroying U.S. economy is not a limit on the U.S. economy. That is only a limit within the theory of liberals. Conservatives should know better. As you know, naturalistic ideologies through the courses of time had been informing both the economic and social quarters. Within the economic domain, there is the argument between free market and socialism. And within the social domain, there is the naturalist obsession with race and sex. In those two areas of life, there are elements to which naturalism refers to as income, wealth, wage, work, property, race, and sex, or gender, etc. What is important to remember is that the reason naturalism is attacking those elements within its own theory is because naturalism thinks of them as instances of the so-called distinctions, differences, dualities, inequalities, or ideologies. The distinctions and perceptions which naturalism is seeking to annihilate are functionally the same thing. Simply put, the ideology of naturalism is attempting to attribute those elements within the status of ideology as opposed to reality because it is unable to categorize them, thus to qualify as real. And that which naturalism regards as ideology, namely the so-called world of distinctions, also called the world of appearances, or the world of inequalities, naturalism is trying to eradicate from existence, since those non-changing elements of reality are non-reducible to category, concept, idea, principle, or law, thus are evidence of reality in itself, which by its very existence discredits naturalism, exposing it as the actual privilege and ideology. So we are witnessing the ideology of naturalism militating against reality within every domain of man's life, including the economic and social. Which should be obvious by now is that inasmuch as the ideology of naturalism is trying to account for, read, destroy, incomes, wages, property, race, or sex, that assault is conducted on the naturalistic false premise that naturalism is referring to actual things, namely distinctions, differences, incomes, wages, property, race, and sex, and not to their attempted concepts within its own naturalistic paradigm. So just because the ideology of naturalism cannot justify the existence of the attempted concept of different incomes, or the concept of different or unequal sexes, or the concept of different races, or the concept of different or unequal wages, that is not yet sufficient to discredit the existence of reality outside concepts, namely different incomes, different races, or different sexes, or different anything, as that would require making a difference to, or a claim about incomes or wages or races to begin with, which naturalism is not. For what is precisely in question is whether income minus the author, namely he who has earned the income, is in fact an income and not just a reference to an attempted idea or concept of income. Differences need justification to exist only within the circular ideology of naturalism. not in reality, where each and every difference and distinction is free to live in peace, keeping in mind that degeneracy of distinctions is not itself an instance of a distinction like liberalism submits, since it is naturalism that is referring to those distinctions. For that reason, those are not really distinctions, being located within naturalism, outside of which the so-called distinctions identified by naturalism are in fact their exact opposite. What is the opposite of distinction? Equation, the attempted equality. And what is essentially an equation or equality? The answer, idea, a concept, a class formed by including similarities and excluding dissimilarities. So just because there is no justification or category for the immoral and needless ideas of distinctions, that does not indicate that differences or distinctions are in need of categorization, conceptualization, classifications, and dehumanization in order to be real. Differences between realities do not require a concept or law in order to be final, objective, real, absolute, and necessary. Naturalism claims the reverse, namely that since the distinctions are not categorizable or equitable, therefore they are not necessary, objective, or complete. Hopefully for us, the ideology of naturalism is not binding. Naturalists like to tell us about the so-called wealth inequality. What should we say? If we had to respond, we could say, prove to me you are referring to wealth or to income and not just to items in your theory. The real, particular performer, which your theory has excluded as unreal, is what completes his work, making it a real object of reference. When you exclude the particular performer from consideration, you are no longer speaking of wealth or income, but of the attempted idea or concept of wealth or income. There is no such thing as ownerless wealth. We live in scarcity, not in abundance, since each unit of wealth corresponds to an owner who is very real, just like the correspondence is very real and not abstract as socialism claims. Wealth is not in abundance, since wealth belongs to those who earn it. The earners are the reality which the ideology of democracy and naturalism exclude as unequals. Why should we privilege the ideology over truth and reality? Socialism operates on these very naturalistic assumptions, namely that reference to reality is law or concept, or at its most basic, the equating. And only from the vantage point of such misreference, the authors of Income and Property are not reality, but ideology to be discounted. Likewise, profit is not seen as reality, but as ideology called surplus value. Why is profit pollution or toxicity according to the ideology of socialism of naturalism? Because the questionable relation between profit of the producer and wages of the employees do not have a common denominator. It lacks category, therefore reality. So argues naturalism. Naturalism claims that the distance, the border, or the relation between profit and wages is not categorizable, therefore not justified to exist, as if profit needed justification. Profit is simply a result greater than the cost, but so are the wages. Cost is the highest valued alternative given up. To attack profit is a symptom of nihilism. There is no reason required as to why profit should measure up to justification, principle, or concept or idea. Why should reality, such as profit, needed to be ruled by ideas? Well, because law or ideology is the way of referring to reality, according to naturalism. The same thing can be observed with the so-called income inequality. Is it true incomes are unequal? It depends who asks. The answer is, it is not true that incomes are unequal, since incomes minus their authors are not incomes at all, but a linguistic convention, an attempted idea of income. Incomes are not unequal, since each income corresponds exactly to him who has earned it. That correspondence is reality, not ideology. There is exactly one-to-one correspondence, not one-to-many, like naturalists imagine. The correspondence is the income. The mere numeral without the person is not an income, since self-awareness is unable to categorize or find common denominator for that correspondence. It rejects the cornerstone of income, the income in itself, and then it sets out on millennia-long quest To find the income in itself only to conclude such thing cannot exist. Income is a payment for a performer, not for performance without the performer. So since incomes or wages always and necessarily correspond to the worker, there is no sense of opportunity in which income could be unequatable to some other income, since income's supposed to equal one's own value on the market and not to some other, so-called income without its maker. There is no opportunity for such attempted equation within reality.